What I want to talk about today is one word, which is fear, and exactly how we think about it, and some problems that we have when we do research on this topic that are not specific so much to fear in many ways, but to any topic that is drawn from our own psychological introspective experience when we try to investigate it. But I'll be specifically talking about fear and to some extent anxiety. And I want to go through, let's see, this is some history of the word fear as it's been used in psychology. I have a very bad, maybe I'll have to sit here because I can't really see from this monitor. But all of this changed when the behaviorists took over. Watson described fear as a Pavlovian reflex, Skinner as a propensity to learn about danger on the basis of one's reinforcement history. Tolman and Hall talked about intervening variables and hypothetical constructs that connect threats with behavioral responses. And Hebb, Morgensteller, Bindra, and others talked about central physiological states. Now, these central physiological states were brain states that serve the function that Tolman and Hall were talking about as intervening variables or hypothetical constructs. They were trying to explain what those intervening variables and hypothetical constructs were, and that's what these central states became. Now, by the 1960s, though, in psychiatry, Freud still dominated, and fear and anxiety reviewed as conscious experiences that reflected repressed unconscious conflict. And an important development took place when Peter Lang tried to make fear a scientific topic. And he said that it was necessary to escape the hidden phenomenology of fear in order to understand it scientifically. And he described fear in terms of three responses: verbal behavior, overt behavior such as avoidance, and physiological responses in the body and brain. Now, for Freud, it was a subjective state, whereas for Lang, it was a composite set of objective responses. Now, interestingly, Lang did not go the route of the central state because he said that if it was a central state, then all of the responses should be going together. But what he found was that the verbal behavior and behavioral responses and physiological responses didn't always coordinate with each other. They weren't always going in the same direction. They were poorly correlated. So that he sought a different. He was coming at it from a very different angle. But what I want to do is ask a couple of questions here. Why is there a poor correlation between behavioral and physiological measures? Let's start with that point. Well, first of all, behavior is not a single thing controlled in a unified way in the brain. And in the case of a threat stimulus, there are at least two kinds of behaviors we need to consider. One are reactions that are automatically elicited by a threat, for example, freezing or flight. These are based on innate motor programs, and they come with a pre-wired set of autonomic adjustments. They also can result in homeostatic changes that result as the behavior unfolds, whereas the actions, for example, escape, avoidance, and so forth, are learned on the basis of reinforcement in many cases. There are arbitrary responses that solve the problem of how to deal with danger, and they don't have any built-in homeostatic, autonomic programs that go with them. So you can see there's lots of opportunity for things to be uncorrelated when you look at it simply from the point of view of behavior and physiology. We have to ask what behavior, even if we take something like the innate behaviors such as freezing, there will be a component of it that's likely to be highly correlated with physiological responses. Those are the autonomic patterns that are initially triggered in conjunction with the behavior, but then there are going to be the homeostatic responses. So you can't simply look at blood pressure or heart rate or galvanic skin response over a prolonged period of time and expect it to correlate with behavior, even with an innate behavior. These are very complicated things, and we need to refine our assessment of what we're talking about here. And why is self-report not consistent with behavior or physiology? Well, I think the bottom line, an important topic that or important conclusion I want to leave you with at the end of the talk is that the conscious feelings of fear that we have are controlled by different systems, different from both the reactive systems and the action systems in the brain. Now, in the late 60s and 70s, cognitive science began to infiltrate psychology. And this brought both some good things and some bad things. For one thing, it brought the mind back to psychology, but not the mind that the behaviorist had gotten rid of. The cognitive mind was an information processing system, not a place where conscious experiences occurred. So these information processing systems function non-consciously for the most part, and consciousness could be the end result of a lot of non-conscious processing. Now, but with the success of cognitive science, there also resulted a kind of free-for-all in terms of mentalism. It brought this sort of ability to bring mentalism back into psychology without any of the constraints that the behaviorist had imposed. So we have a real free-for-all today where people can talk about mental states in animals without any justification whatsoever. For example, a paper published in Science this past year, this is what they found. Crayfish explored their environment more when they were given benzodiazepines, and they concluded the emotional life of invertebrates may be richer than we assumed. This led to all sorts of headlines. Anxious crayfish can be treated like humans. Even crayfish get anxious, New York Times. Crayfish may experience a form of anxiety, the BBC. So what we're doing is we're taking simple behavioral responses and extending those into the mental life of an organism as simple as an invertebrate crawfish. I'm from Louisiana, so we could say crawfish, not crayfish. Now, Jane Goodall is a very respected primatologist, but I think she uses things, she comes at it from a very impressionistic point of view. Here's a quote from her. Farm animals feel pleasure and sadness, excitement and resentment, depression, fear, and pain. They are far more aware and intelligent than we ever imagined. They are individuals in their own right. And also that animals show emotions similar to those we describe in ourselves. Now, how can she possibly know any of this? Simply on the basis of their behavior, but we know even in people that responses that seem like they're driven by fear are not necessarily driven by the conscious experience of fear. Now, I agree completely with her. Her point here was to not mistreat farm animals, that we shouldn't have chickens that are crowded together in tight pens, and we shouldn't have pigs that are crowded in this way. They are organisms, and they deserve to be treated properly. And there are laws, strict laws in research as to how we treat animals. There should be stricter laws, I think, in the food industry as well. And of course, they're intelligent because they can perform, depending on how you define intelligence, but intelligence is a behavioral interaction with the environment in complex ways. They can do amazing things, but that doesn't mean that they're feeling fear and sadness and love and resentment and pain and so forth as she describes. I like this quote from Nico Tinbergen, one of the great-grandfathers of modern ethology. He says, hunger, like anger, fear, and so forth, is a phenomenon that we can only know by introspection. When applied to another species, it is merely a guess about the possible nature of the animal's subjective state. Now, this is a big problem in my own field called Pavlovian fear conditioning, or that's the traditional name for it. I've worked on this topic for more than 30 years now, and I've always struggled with the middle word, fear. Do we really condition fear in a rat when we do this? And if so, how do we know that we do? And if not, what sort of problems does that lead to? I mean, there's a lot of research. We heard a question just now about the amygdala. The amygdala has become a very, very popular part of the brain. When I started working on this 30 years ago, nobody had heard of the amygdala. It was an obscure part of the brain that, people didn't care much about. The hippocampus was getting all the attention. So we need to come to terms with exactly what we mean when we talk about fear, because it has broad implications for the way research is done in psychiatry and the way even treatment approaches and the way diagnosis is conducted in patients who have problems with fear and anxiety. So it's very common to hear these kinds of expressions when talking about rats that are freezing to a stimulus that's threatening to them. The rats are fearful of the conditioned stimulus. Others will say the frightened rat. The CS is an elicitor of fear. We used freezing as a measure of fear. These are everyday expressions in my field of research. Now, these harken back to a Darwinian idea, which is that when there's a fear stimulus, there's a fearful state of mind that causes a fearful response. And this is something that we have from our own everyday experience. We talk about this all the time in life. If we see our dog run away from a bigger animal, we'll think it's afraid. When I come home and my cat is purring and rubbing my leg, I think he's hungry. It's okay to talk about this in everyday life, but scientifically we need to be more precise. Now, the amygdala is, of course, the heart and soul of the so-called fear system. And that is why Nature, Science, Wired, Discover, Scientific American, and many other publications a couple of years ago had dramatic headlines. Humans can feel terror even when they lack the brain's fear center. Scaring the fearless, evoking fear in the fearless. Researchers scare fearless patient. What scared the fearless woman? Now, the only reason these would be such surprising, disturbing findings and conclusions would be if you believe that the amygdala is the wellspring of fear, that when you turn on the amygdala, fear bubbles up into your mind, and that is where you experience it. Fear is how you experience, the amygdala is how you experience fear. And I don't think that this is the case. Now, this may be surprising coming from someone that you may think of as studying fear in the amygdala. And I've often been misquoted because what I've always said is that the amygdala is involved in the detection and responding to danger. The conscious feeling of fear is a cognitive interpretation of that situation that we find ourselves in, our awareness that our brain is responding in this way, and that's what I want to emphasize today. So let's ask, what does fear conditioning condition? So the common meaning of fear, of course, is the conscious feeling that you have when you're in harm's way. Does fear conditioning condition this feeling? We know that humans can experience fear when exposed to stimuli that have been associated with harm in the past. And we can condition people, and we can present the stimulus to them after they've been conditioned so that they don't know the stimulus is present. In other words, we can use subliminal presentation or masking or other procedures. The person will not know there's any stimulus present, will feel no fear, and their amygdala will be activated, and they will show autonomic nervous system responses. You don't need the feeling of fear to respond to danger, even as a person. So if we don't need fear to explain why people are showing responses to danger, why do we assume that animals are feeling fearful when they respond to danger? So why does this question matter? Is it just semantics? And I want to spend some time on this because I think this is an important point here. Research on fear and anxiety in animals is being used to understand what has changed in the brains of people having problems regulating fear and anxiety, and also how to treat these problems. The subjective component of anxiety is a major complaint of these people. They feel bad and they want to feel better. So findings about circuits that detect and respond to threats in animals are being talked about as if they explain these conscious feelings. If the conditioning circuits, though, are not the source of these subjective symptoms, then findings from conditioning research are being misinterpreted. Conditioning circuits contribute to, but are not the same thing as feeling circuits. They are not responsible for fear. So symptoms of fear and anxiety based on conscious and non-conscious processes may well be vulnerable to different predisposing factors and also may be requiring different treatments. So if we use the term fear to talk about these unconscious processes that detect and respond to danger and the conscious feelings that people experience and want to get rid of, we may be doing a disservice to people who are trying to treat these problems. And I think my colleagues are not happy when I talk this way because they think, well, our research is no longer going to be appreciated by psychiatrists and mental health professionals because it's not fear. Well, what I say is, no, it's not fear, but we shouldn't be telling people it's fear if it's not fear. Why should we be selling you something that is not the truth? The problem is that, the truth is that even though the amygdala is not making fear, it is contributing. And if we come to a more accurate understanding of exactly how it is contributing, we're going to be much better off than if we're selling people a bill of goods about what it doesn't contribute. In order for the field to move forward, we really have to be precise in how we deal with these terms: fear, anxiety, and so forth. These come from our subjective mental states, from our introspections. It's not like schizophrenia, which is diagnosed as an abnormal problem. Fear and anxiety are normal states that we all experience that can be dysregulated in some people. And because we experience them, we want to study and understand them. But if we study and understand them by going from our subjective experiences into the brains of animals and trying to find those experiences in those animals, we're not going to get very far. So there's always been this tension between subjectively experienced aspects of emotions and the objective measures. Here's a quote from the developmental psychologist Jerry Kagan. Neuroscientists use fear to explain the empirical relation between two events. For example, rats freeze when they see a light previously associated with electric shock. Psychiatrists, psychologists, and most citizens, on the other hand, use fear to mean a conscious experience of those who dislike driving over high bridges or encountering large spiders. These two uses suggest several fear states, each with its own genetics, incentives, physiological patterns, and behavioral profiles. The only thing I would quibble with here is I don't think they're two different fear states. Only one of them is a fear state, the experience of fear. The other stuff is something else. It's very important, but it's not fear. So human research on emotions is necessarily based on the scientist's personal interest and introspections. I got interested in emotion because I thought that was an important part of human experience. And the way you go at this, if you're a psychologist, is you search your own mind for what's of interest to you. And introspection tells us that some mental states have a feeling associated with them. And we use the terms emotion and feeling interchangeably often. We take these words like fear, anger, love, jealousy, and we use these feeling words as a way to go into the brain and find emotions in the brain. I think this is wrong. So here's some standard human emotion words. These are basic emotions, for example, from the Ekman list. You could come up with other lists. But when we start with these words and go into the brain, maybe this is legitimate to some extent in the human brain, but it's much more difficult when we try to use these same approaches when we go into the brains of rats. How can we find joy and love and sadness in the brain of a rat? These are experiences. Now, we might say, well, we're looking for the correlates of those experiences. But correlates are not causes. If we want to know the causes, we have to come at this from a different approach. Basically, we're all anthropomorphic. It's natural. It may even be a genetic capacity or an innate capacity of the human brain. So we assume that if an animal is responding in a way that resembles the way a human responds, then the human feels fear, then the animal must feel fear. But just because something is natural doesn't mean it's correct. The world seems like it's flat, but we know it's not. We think we describe the sun as rising, but we know it doesn't rise. So we have to think about the way we use these terms. Francis Bacon warned us long ago about the danger of using common language in science. What happens is we reify some referent of the word and give it a reality that it doesn't warrant. So here's a couple of animals we're all familiar with. This guy is afraid he's going to get eaten, and this guy wants to eat him, so he's feeling fear, and the other is feeling pleasure and anticipation of what he's going to eat. So what do we do about this? How do we come to terms with fear, and especially in the context of fear conditioning? So this is the standard way we talk about it. We have a conditioned fear stimulus that elicits these conditioned responses. The amygdala sits in the middle, and so the amygdala is the centerpiece of this fear system. I think we can neutralize some of this by changing the language. It's a threat stimulus. It's not a fear stimulus. Threat is a neutral word. It implies nothing about subjective experience. It's something that is dangerous to all members of the species. It's obvious what a threat is. A fear response can be called a defense response. There's, again, no subjective state associated with that. And a fear circuit, a threat defense circuit. And we can call this a defensive survival circuit rather than a fear circuit. And what's important, though, is the amygdala is not involved simply in aversive behavior. It also contributes to a lot of things. So we can't simply just talk about the amygdala in terms of defense. Now, again, why this matters is this is not simply semantics. When I do research on these defensive behaviors and talk about them, if I don't talk about it this way, or even if I do talk about it this way, sometimes I'm still interpreted as being a researcher who's studying fear. I've never studied fear. I've never studied fear, the conscious experience. I've only studied the way the brain detects and responds to danger. Now, so my point is that human subjective experience is not the best starting point to get to these phenomena that are relevant to emotion. So how should we do this? How should we go at these human emotions? How can we get at this? What we have to do is separate the phenomena that are of interest from the overarching concept of emotion. What are the key phenomena? Responses that occur when an organism faces challenges and opportunities. Situations in which survival or well-being is potentially compromised or enhanced. Here's some examples. So, in the face of a predator, the organism has a chance to escape or not. Low energy supplies, get food or not. Fluid imbalance, you need to drink. Hypothermia, you need to obtain warmth. Reproductive isolation, search for a potential mate. Now, these are basically the things that researchers study if they're studying animals and they're interested in the topic of emotion or motivation. Threat, chance to predatory behaviors, pain, food, drink, mating, and so forth. These are the key topics. And these would be of interest even if we never had the words emotion in our vocabulary, emotions or feelings in our vocabulary. So the circuits that underline these functions, like defense, energy management, fluid balance, thermoregulation, and reproduction, are highly conserved within mammals and to a certain extent even within all vertebrates. These are systems that occur, that are engaged when organisms face these challenges and opportunities. So here's, for example, in a horse, we have certain sexual hormones that are responsible for sexual behavior. They're highly localized in the horse brain and in the brains of all other mammals. But we have to be careful. I'm not talking about the conservation of behavior. I'm talking about the conservation of neural circuits and molecular mechanisms to a greater extent. For example, in order for rats to become pregnant, the female has to adopt a certain posture. This is called lordosis. If she doesn't adopt this posture, the semen can't reach the egg and fertilize the egg. Now, this can only happen during a certain part of her monthly cycle, and so it's totally driven by her hormonal state. Now, in primates, there's no hormonal state that's required for sexual behavior, and people do it in all kinds of different ways. So it's not behavior that's highly conserved. What's conserved is the neural circuits that are responsible for these behaviors. Now, obviously, there's some subtle change in the circuitry that allows different behaviors to be expressed, but the conserved element of all this is the circuit and the molecular and genetic mechanisms underlying these. The conceptual linkage of emotion with basic mechanisms that underlie these behavioral interactions with the environment when we face challenges and opportunities has hijacked our understanding of emotions and their behaviors. Now, all animals have to do these things. They all have to solve these basic problems: detect and respond to threats, detect and respond to nutrients and energy sources, balance fluids and electrolytes, thermoregulate, and reproduce. But not only the traditional things that we would call animals, including all vertebrates, but also invertebrates, worms, flies, bees, starfish, but also single-cell organisms. So if you, I don't have a pointer here, but if you look at the top right panel, the bacteria in the petri dish are dispersed uniformly throughout the petri dish, but then acid has been poured into the petri dish on the bottom gray panel, and so the bacteria all move away. Bacteria have to be able to detect harmful agents in their chemical environment and use their flagella to wiggle away from the harm. It's just a part of life that they have to have in order to survive. If there are nutrients, they have to move towards them. They use the flagella to move towards nutrients rather than away. They have to balance their fluids in order to maintain the integrity of the intracellular and extracellular environment, which is their whole life. They have to thermoregulate, and they have to reproduce in order for in their case, divide in order for their species to survive. So these are not things that make emotions. These are just components or requirements of life. Now, people do the same thing. Here's a people in a swimming pool, you pour acid in, they all move away. So again, there are fundamental aspects of being alive. And this is a trivial example, you may say, and yet it's not. It's part of what it means to be alive, is to be able to determine what's dangerous in your life and to respond in a way that will keep you alive. If you can also consciously experience that that's happening to you, with you in capital letters, then you have the conscious experience of fear while you're doing this. If not, you're simply detecting and responding to danger in a way that evolution has allowed you to do. Now, there are many differences between people and bacteria, obviously. But as we go from single-cell organisms to multicellular colonies to multi-system organisms that have multiple organs within them, the complexity changes, but the fundamental life forces remain the same. Now, the purpose of the nervous system is to regulate all of this. So the nervous system keeps track of all the activities of the various systems. Now, the nervous system of all vertebrates is essentially the same. As we go from fish through mammals, we see that the basic organization of a forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain remains conserved. Even specific circuits within the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain are conserved. Things get much more complex as we go through the evolutionary scale, evolutionary tree, I should say. But the basic organization remains the same. But this is not the case in invertebrates, which have very different kinds of nervous system. And the kind of invertebrate we evolved from has nothing to do with our nervous system. And that happens to be some starfish-like creature the explanation of that is too complicated, but it's a starfish which has a certain kind of nervous system that's very different from, for example, an arthropod which has a cerebral ganglion or a cephalic ganglion, which is more like a brain. The organisms we evolved from didn't have a cephalic ganglion at all. So the point, though, is that there's a tremendous conservation of these processes across vertebrates and invertebrates. The circuits will be very different, for example, in a fruit fly or an aplysia, but the molecular mechanisms can be very similar. I want to give a couple of examples before I move on. One is that the NMDA receptor gene, which Jeff described as important in schizophrenia, potentially important in schizophrenia, can not only be studied in rats and mice, but also in invertebrates and also in plants. The NMDA receptor gene is present in plants. Also, the serotonin transporter gene is present in plants, and research on SSRIs is being done in plants because these processes are highly conserved across many levels of evolution. The action potential, which is the basis of nervous system function, originated in single-cell organisms as a way to repair the cell wall. So if you have a single-cell organism and your only separation from the outside world is your cell membrane, and there's damage to the cell membrane, you will die unless you can repair your cell wall. So what occurred is the single cell evolved the capacity to generate an electrical spark at the site of injury. And that spark then attracted nutrients from inside and outside the cell to help repair the cell wall. Now, as multicellular organisms began to develop, this mechanism was co-opted to use as a way of intercellular communication between cells, and that is the origin of the nervous system. So again, these very basic processes are highly, highly conserved in evolution, and just because something is important in human behavior and human thought, for example, the NMDA receptor, does not mean it is in our brain for the purpose that it's used in our brain. This is a slide from David Glanzman, and it shows work from many, many labs, studies in invertebrates, for example, the aplysia, as well as fruit flies, as well as rats and mice. Every signaling pathway on this slide is an example of something that is important in Pavlovian conditioning in invertebrates and invertebrates. So aplysia and fruit flies, as well as rats and mice, and probably people as well. So the molecular machinery underlying something as important as learning is conserved, independent of the fact that the nervous system in the aplysia or fruit fly is very, very different from in a rat, mouse, or a human. So these things, such as our survival behaviors, can be conserved in spite of the fact that there are structural differences between the way the systems work. This is from the work of Seth Grant. It makes the same point about signaling pathways in invertebrates and invertebrates, flies and mice in this case. But there's a more profound element to this, that the conservation, and this is the NMDA pathway again, but the conservation of the NMDA pathway that Seth has found goes on into, again, single-cell organisms, fungi and so forth, and things that are far removed from the natural history of humans. So what does the theory of fear have to account for? In English, we have more than three dozen words for variants of fear and anxiety. But not all fears are based up on these bottom-up processes initiated by the amygdala in threat detection. For example, fear of not leading a meaningful life, or fear of the eventuality of death. Fear is the awareness that you are in the presence of some kind of threat, whether it's a physical or an existential threat. This is a cognitive process that depends on language, culture, and self-awareness. While all organisms can detect and respond to threats, only organisms that know that the threat is happening to them feel fear. If other animals feel fear, it's likely to be very different from the kind of experience we have. Threat detection contributes to fear, but it is not one and the same thing as fear. So I like to think of emotions in terms of a soup analogy. A lot of different ingredients can go into making a soup. For example, water, onions, garlic, carrots, celery, salt, pepper, chicken. None of these are soup ingredients. They're things that exist in nature that can be combined in a certain way to make soup and give it a characteristic flavor. The same thing can be said, well, let me talk about soup some more. So if we take this chicken soup and all of a sudden, instead of putting chicken in, we put in shrimp, we have a different kind of soup. If we put in roux, we end up with a gumbo. If we put in curry paste, we end up with something more Asian-like. We can change the complete character of the soup, the qualitative character of the soup by these kinds of changes, or We can simply change the intensity of the soup by adding more salt or more garlic. And so these are different ways that we can adjust the soup. And I guess the point is that the same thing can be going on in the brain, that we have all sorts of processes in the brain that exist not to make emotions, but that exist for other purposes, but when they're combined in a certain way, give rise to the conscious experience of fear or other emotions. For example, sensory processing, that of course exists for general purposes. Survival circuit activity, there are lots of survival circuits, not just the ones involved in threat. And I should point out that the defensive survival circuit that's important for predatory kinds of danger, those are not the only that's not the only survival circuit that can generate the feeling of fear. If you're dehydrated, you can become fearful that you're going to die of not having something to drink. Or if you are lacking food, you can fear that you will die of starvation. Or you might fear that you're going to die from failing to thermoregulate properly if you're stuck on top of a mountain and it's beginning to snow. So the point is that fear is not something that's coming out of a circuit in the brain, or not out of one of these survival circuits. Fear is a psychological construction. It's coming out of a circuit, but it's a circuit that involves working memory and its ability to integrate various aspects that can be monitored and experienced from these various other processes. Many of these processes occur unconsciously in the brain, and we only know them through our ability to monitor their external consequences. For example, if we see ourselves freezing or startling or running away, as William James says, we can become afraid. Or if we, let's say if you're a person who has a history of panic attacks and you feel a certain tightness in your chest, that can be interpreted as the sign of an oncoming panic attack, and you'll then begin to feel panic and terror that this is happening. So consciousness is an important part of fear. Once we understand what consciousness is, we'll understand emotions. Until then, we have all these other mechanisms we need to study that operate independent of conscious awareness, and that we can make a lot of progress on without solving the problem of consciousness. And in this paper in Neuron a couple of years ago, I introduced these two concepts. One, the survival circuit, which I already talked about, but also a global organismic state, a state that the survival circuit triggers, and that becomes the sort of summation of all the ingredients that then that are consciously experienced in working memory. So let me just put this up here to kind of walk you through it. So there's a threat stimulus, and that threat stimulus obviously can be consciously experienced because it'll go to the visual cortex, and that will then allow it to go into prefrontal cortex, and working memory can then be apprised of that stimulus. Through working memory, you can also retrieve long-term memories about that stimulus. Let's say it's a snake. You can retrieve long-term memories, semantic memories. You know that snakes are venomous and potentially dangerous. You can retrieve episodic memories that maybe you've once encountered a snake and it bit you, so you have that to draw upon. So those experiences are coming together in working memory of a perceptual event, memories about that perceptual event, that begin to create a conscious experience of what's going on. But in order to turn that conscious experience into what we call an emotional experience, you need, in many cases, this kind of defensive survival circuit to give it the charge and the extra impetus that makes it what we commonly think of as fear. So the threat stimulus, in addition to going to cortex, is going to the amygdala, where which is part of this defensive survival circuit, activating the threat detectors, activating responses. The responses are being expressed in behavior. They're feeding back to the brain. They're also being monitored through working memory. All of this is coalescing in consciousness to give rise to a feeling of fear that you are impelled to have. It's a cognitive interpretation, a summation in consciousness. It doesn't mean that you have to intentionally interpret it. You have schemas in your brain that you formed from the first time your parents said, "Oh, that must have been very scary to you," or, oh, that must have made you very anxious. You form these schemas and you begin to recognize what fearful or anxious experiences are like, and when you begin to recognize elements through pattern completion in working memory, you're able to construct a feeling of fear on the basis of those expectations. So I want to just close with this last slide and add a couple of points here. One is that anxiolytic drugs are developed on behaviors that really operate on these defensive survival circuits. When you're testing animals in, quote, fear conditioning tasks or inhibitory avoidance tasks or various risk assessment tasks, open field, elevated plus maze, you're dealing with behavioral systems that can detect and respond to danger. Now, those drugs will change those systems very effectively. That's what they're designed to do. But the patient feels fear and anxiety through other systems. And maybe the reason that these drugs don't work as well as we would like them to is not because they aren't doing what they were designed to do, but we're asking them to do the wrong thing. To change consciousness, you need to change consciousness. And perhaps psychotherapy is still the best way to do that. But you can't simply change consciousness alone. You have to also change the underlying survival circuit activity. So, and I'm not saying that drugs are necessarily the best way to change the survival circuit activity as well, because there are lots of ways that are coming out of neuroscience based on memory research that we're able to alter memories in a certain way in the brain that then change the behavioral responses that the animal or person will execute in the presence of a threat. So if we look at the top left corner there, if conscious feelings of fear controlled by different systems and those that detect and respond to threats, different treatments will be required. That's an important point I want to make. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a therapist. I've never been in therapy. I know nothing about it. So you can either take it or leave it, but I come from this from the point of view of how the brain works. And finally, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about avoidance and other new tasks that we've been studying, because almost all of my research is focused on how we react to danger. But over the last 10 years or so, we've been turning to how actions are also important. And I want to talk about, tomorrow I want to talk about avoidance in two ways. One is the pathological way that we're all familiar with from the point of view of anxiety, but also from the point of view, a different point of view, I want to talk about proactive avoidance, which I will talk about as a form of active coping that's actually something useful, I think.